Hello, and welcome to Chapter 17, The Late Agrarian World 3, Cultural Frames and Cultural Encounters, 1500 to 1800. As usual, I want to begin the issues that we will encounter in framing the argument of this chapter. Firstly, we're going to look at the impact of globalized encounters, so how people from often vastly different areas of the world encountered each other and how they interpreted these encounters. But also at spreading technologies. Particularly important in this period is the development of print technology in Europe, and how different peoples and societies constructed their identities. Although it's kind of normal to think about your identity as being sort of inherent within you, it is actually a construction of many different ideas. And finally, how they made their worlds meaningful. That's the purpose of culture, is to give the world meaning. And then we're going to go, and this chapter also looks at how such cultural encounters, including religious conflicts and the development of scientific views of the cosmos, contributed to the growing complexity and maturity of the late agrarian era. Very often this period might be called the end of the Middle Ages, and the emphasis put on the leap in the next period. But Murillo, quite correctly, I think, frames the end of the late agrarian era as a pinnacle, as a maturing of things that have been going on before, and not the end of a dark ages. I think you'll probably agree. And then finally we'll look at how specific cultural encounters involving slavery led to important developments in the notion of race, and how these continue to affect our world. So let's take a look at the area of the world that we'll be interested in. And this map obviously shows the Atlantic slave trade, and many Americans think about the Atlantic slave trade as primarily involving America. But around 48% of slaves go to Brazil, and a proportion also goes to the Caribbean, and a smaller proportion ends up in North America. So keep this in mind as we go through this chapter. So the areas of the world are marked out here, and but also some of the ideas of conflicts, religious conflicts, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Europe, between Sunni and Shia in the Middle East, between Muslims and Hindus in northern India, and the conflict that arises when Jesuits take missionary work into East Asia and come into conflict with pre-existing religious traditions. In the Americas, you see this syncretism of Christian and indigenous religions, which give us images like the Virgin of Guadalupe. Okay, so let's have a think about the people that we're going to encounter in our primary sources. And I'm obviously missing a slide here because this was supposed to relate to Hans Staden, but never mind, we'll just carry on regardless. So Hans Staden, his true history was written about he was a German soldier and explorer who traveled to Brazil, and he wrote about his time being captured by the Tupinamba people, who were local hunter-gatherers, and he spent 3 years with them as their captive. And he describes in this extract his captivity, but I'm asking you to read it with a little bit of an open mind. Charges of cannibalism and of extensive polygamy were often levied at other cultures, primitive cultures, to use a kind of pejorative word there, primitive, that may or may not necessarily have been true. It's just a way to describe their barbarism. So let's have a think about that and not necessarily take it 100% for granted that he's telling the truth in this. Okay, we'll think about that one. And our second source is by a nun, a sister, Juana Inés de la Cruz, who wrote The Divine Narcissus in 1689. I'm sorry, I'm reading from my notes here. She was the illegitimate daughter of a Spanish soldier and a Spanish-Mexican woman, a woman born of mixed Spanish and Mexican race. As it said, she went on to become one of the most important indigenous poets and playwrights of this period. And this is quite a beautiful piece to read here. And she's expressing some of the really key elements of what we're thinking about in cultural encounters. And she has characters called Occident, which is the word for West, and America, which express the male and female qualities of the indigenous Americans, and then characters called Zeal and Religion, which express the male and female characters of Spanish peoples. So anyway, I think this is a really interesting piece for thinking about that. And this is a Mexican Baroque cathedral, which really shows this kind of syncretism of religions that happens in Mexico. So moving on, our next reading is 17.3, Kayam al-Din Ramli, who was a jurist of the Hanafi school. It's the school of interpretation of Islamic law. He was one of these ulema that we talked about in the last class. In the last lecture I talked about those are the ones that make legal judgments, and the judgments here are referred to marriage and divorce. So it gives you some insight into women's lives in the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Al-Din Ramli was a Palestinian, and Palestine at this time was under Ottoman rule. We're looking here at an Ottoman mosque. Okay, you can hear a Mughal mosque, so in India. Okay, I've obviously got my slides a little screwy here. So anyway, the next guy has nothing to do with the Tokugawa shrine. This is Ulado Equiano, and this is 17.4. And he is an African who was captured as a boy and is transported first to the Caribbean, then to North America, and then to England, and has this long global journey that follows the path of his slavery. Along the way, he seems to be quite a charming little boy and young man, and he manages to pick up some skills, picks up some extra money doing side jobs, and eventually is able to buy his freedom, and he becomes one of the leading proponents of the anti-slavery movement. So the extract here is about his early life and his encounters with slavers, both African and European. And then our last reading, again, has nothing to do with the Tokugawa shrine, but it's a pretty picture, we'll leave it on, is Francis Bacon, who is one of our scientists, and we've finished with science in this book, because we're talking about cultural encounters, and science does fit in here. It's not we normally keep science and technology off on the side, but it really does fit in with this whole idea of what's happening around the world and thinking about things in a new way. So Bacon is famous for his inductive method of scientific analysis, and what he outlines here are the impediments to the future of science. And it's kind of interesting to think how many of these apply today and which impediments we may have got overcome and which ones we still encounter. Okay, so sorry about the little screw up with the slides. So what we're going to talk about in the first place is identity formation. That we all experience the world through a cognitive filter, through how we understand things. That's not to say that reality doesn't exist, but all realities are experienced from a particular perspective. Okay, so we can express this in terms of our model, in terms of frames, cultural frames, which are the almost unconscious set of assumptions that we have about the world and how it operates, and cultural screens, which are the more public representations of issues that we discuss as a culture. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the traditional pyramid and where culture comes in. And I think we've seen this before, this great cultural divide coming across, separating the elites from the non-elite culture. Elite culture, we've said before, is unitary, transregional and written. Because it's written down, it can cross more easily between different regions. If an empire is a vast region, people can still transmit their culture backwards and forwards. And the people at the top tend to have one culture. The people lower down tend to have many different cultures because their culture is not easily transmitted, because it's more local and it's oral, it's not written down, so it's harder for it to get around. Okay, so this is the great cultural divide. But when it comes to how we view a society and what's been left for us to view, this is very often just a matter of material evidence. Who is writing things down? Who is making things of durable products, which we will find in grave sites or in archaeological digs? These tend to come from the top part of the screen. So when we're looking at a society, very often what we can see is the upper part. So one of the questions that Murillo points here is which self is being created. When we look at the construction of self-identity, we have to be very aware that the self that we're looking at is disproportionately representative of the elite. So let's move on now and look at some of these screen images. This is the one I meant to put on earlier of Hans Staden. And so this is him here. I was pointing to my screen, that is totally useless. This is him here, depicting a cannibalistic feast. He's the bearded one. He has, this fig leaf, and these are his initials. Was it really like this? We don't really know. This is a hotly debated issue, or whether he's just sort of signifying that they are barbaric in this manner. Another thing that we're going to look at in this chapter is power differentials, and never underestimate the role of military power in encounters, and also thinking about what these encounters mean. That somebody might write something about an encounter, but at the end of the day, it boils down to something really quite different and sometimes quite horrific at the end of it. So as there are more encounters, the cultural frames and screens become redefined. And one of the ways that we think about this is, that people ask different questions. And one of the different questions that they ask, on top of the standard questions that people ask in culture to make life meaningful, is what counts as human. And towards the sort of latter end of this period, women, children, slaves do not count as fully human. This is the question that Murillo asks, 3 strikes against this poor young black woman here. Okay, and we also get in this culture, in this period, different technologies, particularly, as we've said, the technology of printing, which really acts as an amplifier, magnifying the impact of cultural encounters and cultural developments across the globe, making these things more pervasive. Okay, so let's pause a minute and look at the principles and patterns that we see in this chapter. The impact of new technologies and ideas depends on the cultural frame through which they are seen by those adopting the new technology or an idea. So the principle here is that you can bring along a new technology, say such as printing, but how that printing is used and what it's used to print is very changeable. So if you think about the first printed book, it was the Bible. Okay, so this says a lot about the cultural frame of the Europeans as they found this new technology. This new technology came to them. So the great cultural divide meant that the elites from the hierarchy often had more in common with elites from other hierarchies than with their own commoners. And this was one of the problems of culture. We talked about last time, problems of hierarchies, trying to make that link between the elites and the commoners. You know, if one elite traveled to somewhere quite different, they would still recognize deference and privilege, for example. And lastly, this may seem really obvious, but one of the functions of screen images and cultural frames is to provide meaning. And in the late agrarian age, philosophy and religion were dominated by a sophisticated reworking of much older material from what we call the Axial Age. And this is a period in world history where the world, according to one historian anyway, seems to turn on its axis, and we get these new thinkers that takes the philosophy in a new direction. So in a short period of time, we get Buddha, Confucius, and Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. These are symptomatic of the Axial Age, which took place more than 2,000 years ago, way more than 2,000 years ago. And then in the late agrarian period, we're still getting reworkings of them, a very sophisticated, mature reworkings of them. And basically, they're trying to still answer the same kinds of questions. What is the relationship of individual ethics to social order, and of social order to the cosmos? These are the perennial questions that need to be answered. Okay, I'm going to leave that there for the first part.